No Box Dance presents Dance Behind the Screen, process production, and social media. Don't forget, say no to the box. Dile no a la caja. 고정관념이란 상자에서 벗어나세요.
Welcome back to Dance Behind the Screen podcast. This is your host, Martheya. In season 6, our theme is dance and technology. Our goal this season is to talk about how dance can coexist in a world of screens, social media, and interactive technology. Today's guest has created the Alexander Whitley Dance Company that uses digital technology to deepen the appreciation of and widen access to dance. Welcome to our show, Alex.
Hi. Yeah.
So the company was founded, and I quote, in response to the new creative possibilities emerging from developments in digital technology and the interdisciplinary practices forming around it. Can you start us off by talking about what those emerging digital technologies were at the time when you created the company?
Yeah, I guess the company was officially founded in 2014, but I had been developing my practice as a choreographer several years prior to that. And I guess what was of particular interest to me around that time was the development of interactive technologies. And it was the release of the Xbox Kinect, a tracking device that was developed for a games console that changed an awful lot for how independent digital artists and creative technologists could do motion tracking. Prior to that, it had been quite an expensive technology, and certainly not the kind of thing that would be easy for independent artists working on relatively low budgets to have access to. I was fascinated by what that meant for me as a choreographer and for dance in general in terms of the impact that dance and the moving body could have, and how these kinds of technologies could extend the reach of the moving body as a driver of systems that generate different kind of visual or auditory outputs. And then also what that meant in terms of staging work that combined these elements, where there was a combination of live performers and interactive media. And that's not to say that I was the first person to do this. There's a kind of long and great history of people experimenting with these kind of technologies prior to this point. But I guess the difference was the accessibility and relative affordability of these technologies. So for me as an independent artist forming a company, it was something that was available to work with, and it really piqued my curiosity.
I'm very curious about how you approach selecting which type of motion tracking that you intend to use for specific projects. I think I mentioned before this conversation that as an artist myself in a company I co-founded, Mixed Emotus, we too are really interested in this intersection between the human and the digital. And so we worked with different programs like Notch, Touch Designer, Stable Diffusion. We worked with the Kinect in many different kind of ways. But I'm curious about, what's your selection process? Do you come into the room, okay, this is the work that I want to make. This technology would be appropriate to take it to another level, or are you creating both of those worlds at the same time, simultaneously? And I ask this for selfish reasons because I feel like I'm trying to figure out the best way to navigate working with technology to produce a really clear outcome for the audience.
Yeah, it's a good question. And it's quite difficult to answer in a way that I don't think there is really clear beginnings and ends in that development trajectory, in that obviously the knowledge you have about the way technology works informs the ideas you have, the kind of creative concepts you have, and it's important to be able to take those into consideration. But also there are sometimes ideas that emerge that you then need to find the appropriate technology to enable. And I think where we run into the biggest challenges in making this kind of work is where we go into a production with some kind of hunches or rough ideas of the kind of thing the outcomes we want to arrive at, and then struggle to get the technology to deliver that, or find as you're developing the systems, because from my experience, within our productions, we're using some off-the-shelf technology in terms of the hardware, the tracking devices, the Connect or motion capture suits. But there's an awful lot of bespoke software that has to be created in order to do something really original and unique and appropriate to the creative concepts you're exploring. And building those systems, especially around the constraints of a touring theatre production, can be really challenging. And so, yeah, in that respect, having a really clear idea, not only of what the technology is capable of, but also having the system to facilitate and enable a creative process around the use of that technology is really what you need before you start making. And often you're trying to do all of that at the same time.
You are listening to Knobbox Dance.
And it can be challenging because I think, as you probably know from being a dancer and being in a dance studio, the creation process can be amazingly fluid in how ideas develop between choreographer and dancers, and ideas unfold and are shaped often non-verbally. We're riffing off and responding to each other physically as well as verbally, and responding to the music as well. And there can be a really wonderful flow in that process of creation that the introduction of technology can disrupt really painfully, in that if you're reliant on a tracking system, for example, to be able to develop the choreography or to understand how the choreography relates to the other elements and parts of a production. If that system isn't working fluidly enough, you can be completely stuck. That's been a huge part of our learning process as a company, and it's something we really try and factor into our creative processes, is how to build in that R&D time to develop the technology to a point where we know we can safely put it into that kind of studio production setting and it not be too disruptive, or just to have enough R&D to be aware of the issues we're contending with and then plan around them. Yeah, but it's not easy. And the technologies are changing and developing all the time as well. So that's one of the challenges, is that there are potentially new solutions on the horizon. That, I think, is another kind of issue in itself, is that seductive element of technology that is always going to solve the problem at some point in the near future, but never does, and actually just introduces problems more than it does solutions. But yeah, that's the kind of love-hate relationship I have with technology.
I think many of us can definitely relate with that. And I want to take this I have two different avenues we could go down. One is this like conversation around collaboration, especially when you're working with technology and designers and things like that. And then the other is some more practical tips for working with technology. So maybe we can try to weave the two together as we chat. How do you approach the collaborative process? From my experience, and I have to say, we are very much an emerging company, and the works we're creating are just kind of project to project basis, depending on the types of funding we get and space and things like that. So by no means are we touring works and at the scale that you're at as a company. So I'm really hoping to learn from you in how you're approaching collaboration. We often have many conversations, try to create like a common language with words first when we work with the interactive media designer, Joel, and conversation seems to be our starting place. But I'm curious as to what your process looks like, and if you could share some tips for me and our listeners on how to approach collaboration.
Yeah, it's obviously really important that you have a good relationship with your collaborators, and that you have a common understanding of your shared goals, and I guess as much reciprocal understanding of each other's process and craft and the tools that are being used on either side. And I guess there's always an element of risk in collaboration. as a company, have collaborated with quite a broad range of different artists. And each project runs slightly differently according to those personal relationships you have with your collaborator. And I think in the context of working with technologies, with new and experimental technologies, having long-term collaborations is really helpful in that respect, because you can learn together, build up shared knowledge and understanding, and really, iterate on your ideas and get further on in your creative process, because you're often, and as I was referring to before, you're often, when you go into the studio to create a dance production without the presence of any of this kind of technology, your day one is going in with your materials and ideas, and you're getting going with your group of dancers. And you, obviously, there's other elements to consider in terms of the music and the costume or set design that might have some implications on that. But generally, they're things that can be relatively easily accommodated around it. Whereas, working with new technologies often requires building new instruments and learning how to play those instruments before you can even get into the studio to start making. And so having, and also these parts are being often created independently. So having real clarity with your collaborators about what the milestones are, what the kind of objectives are at various stages through the process can be really important, and having regular opportunities to bring them back together and test them out. Because the worst thing is that you do some work, ideating with a collaborator, you go your separate ways, work is done, money is spent on that work. You come back together in the studio only to discover that you've got something completely different from what you'd expected. And it doesn't do anything near what you hoped or wished or expected it was going to do. And so you're having to completely recalibrate your ideas around the quantity that you actually have rather than the thing that you expected to have. There's always that kind of negotiation, but I've been lucky to build up some really trusted long-term relationships with digital artists and developers who have become integral to pretty much every production we do now, because there's always some place that they can fit in and occupy a really valuable role. So there's a developer in particular called Luca Biada, Italian digital artist who is based here in London, who's been working really closely with us for a long time now. And he's quite unique in having a really high level of technical skill in working in a range of different software platforms, like games engines like Unity, for example, or Ableton Live, many different other things. In productions where we've invited in other collaborators, he's there under the hood, if you like, building and managing the systems that will coordinate all of these different elements. So that's, I guess having people you really trust and having that kind of common understanding. He understands the constraints of working in theatre, that a coder or a developer with those kinds of skills who might have a background in game design, for example, wouldn't necessarily understand. I think finding those people can be hard. And so my advice would be, if you know someone already, or you found someone that has some of the skills, really hold on to them, build that relationship, find ways of continuing to collaborate and iterate on ideas together.
I'm getting so excited and jotting down so many notes for my next project that I'm working on. A thought struck me about how you're talking about technology, and in your company, you use technology to essentially extend the reach of the moving body, which makes me wonder, do you start with movement first, like with the dance first, and then the technology kind of enhances or amplifies that movement?
Again, I'm sorry to give a kind of ambiguous answer to this, in that it's really hard to say what the direction of travel is between these two. And I think it's actually a constant interaction between these two things, the movement and the technology, in that, yes, on the one hand, I could choreograph something and then either put that in front of a tracking camera or record it with motion capture and then just see what can be created on top of that, see how the technology can extend transform, amplify that piece of choreography. But obviously you need to take into consideration how the technology understands the movement and how it then translates it and represents it. Because often, not often, always there's an element of noise or loss of detail and information in that process of translation. So with the Connect, for example, it's understanding and reading the movement of the body based on seeing it from one perspective. It's sending out infrared lights. It's looking for the shape of a human body, for the skeleton shape, and then mapping that kind of skeleton onto the figure that it sees. But of course, that's fine if you're standing with your limbs all very wide open and clear to see. But as soon as you start dancing and doing enough dance, immediately complexifies the shape of the body.
You lose a limb or something.
That's the interest. Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm. And if you turn and one arm goes behind your torso, that camera can't see it. And so it's trying to guess what that arm is doing, and often failing very miserably at doing it. And so you get noise in the system. So there's a choice then, as the choreographer working with this kind of technology, as to whether you work within the constraints of how that technology understands and is capable of reading and following movement, or an acceptance that it can't, and you've got to deal with the noisiness and inaccuracy of its ability to track the movement, which I guess from a creative perspective, you could assign positive and negative values to either one of those things, in that you could say that there's a negative constraint on having to reduce and simplify the choreography in order to get clean tracking data, and for your system to work smoothly and for you to get a nice clean outcome in the projections, for example, whatever the visual representation, the media representation of that movement is. Or you accept that you've got to deal with noisy, glitchy outcomes in terms of how that movement is represented at the other end. Sometimes that glitch can be a good thing. It can be, you can use that as an effect in order to serve a purpose creatively. And you can also use the constraints that the technology places on the choreography creatively as well. I think any kind of creative process requires some element of constraint. This idea that creativity is just boundless open space of possibility, I think is completely false and wrong. We always need to define really clear constraints in order to enable a stable and coherent creative process. And so if you're willing to adopt in those constraints and think about how far you can go in your creativity while working within very narrow limits of certain possibilities, that can open up new territory. So that, again, has been an interesting journey for me to go in, is understanding how and when I'm willing to adopt those constraints into the choreographic language and vocabulary. Yeah, there are things to be learned and choices to be made about how to adapt and work with these systems in order to generate or arrive at the kinds of outcomes you want, or just learn about the kind of outcomes you're likely to get from it and think about how you can use those creatively. So it's building up a kind of palette, a range of possibilities and movement ideas that you can then start to piece together and construct a dramaturgy or a narrative out of, and understand also how they sit in relation to the other elements in a production, like the music and the visuals, and find the right balance of those things.
I love, Alex, how you talked about the value of having constraints in order to push creativity. That's how we see things at No Box Dance. That's why our tagline is "Say No to the Box." We think it's important to establish those parameters to then explore the unfamiliar and really challenge oneself. And I'm very intrigued. You outlined several challenges when working with different technologies, and it makes me really curious about the digital dance studio that you are creating. And I did sign up for the waitlist, the early access, but I'm wondering if you can share with our listeners, what is this offering and how can we sign up?
Yeah, so this is a project that we've been working on for for some years now, but we're getting close to having something that we'll hopefully be able to release to the public fairly soon. And it's emerged out of our education program, which we've had as a track in the company beginning. And I guess a few years ago, we were thinking about what we would do next as part of our education program. I made a production in 2017 called 8 Minutes, which was a collaboration with a space science center in the UK called RAL Space. And we developed an education program alongside the touring theatre production that was looking at the parallels between artistic and scientific processes. I was set about to do some research to think about how we could most effectively do this. And during COVID, we interviewed quite a few dance teachers from around the UK working in secondary schools. Yeah, between the ages of 11 and 16. And to really understand what their challenges and pain points were in teaching and delivering dance in that kind of context, and where technology might potentially offer a solution. I'm using technology very broadly here, but I guess we were thinking about in the broadest way possible and questioning them on the types of technology that they were currently using or had experimented with using, which is often just a video-based technology, being able to record a video and use it to immediately see the outcomes of what you've done or to provide feedback to students. And so we gathered quite a lot of data from this research and devised a few ideas of some prototype concepts of what we felt might provide a solution to some of the challenges that these teachers are facing. And the idea that really stood out in the end was in building a 3D virtual studio, effectively, in which you can do choreography, explore choreographic ideas, experiment with and view movement in a 3D virtual environment, which I guess for us as a company working with motion capture technology and games engine technology was something that we had been doing quite a lot of. And however, knowing that there is currently a really high barrier to entry into working with these kinds of technologies. Like I was saying before, you need a lot of skill. You need to understand how various different pieces of technology speak to each other in order to be able to work with motion capture content once it's been recorded. And so the idea that we've been working on is to create a piece of software that makes that an awful lot easier and simpler for people, and creates a space in which you can really quickly and easily arrange sequences of movement in order to be able to experiment with different choreographic ideas, or just get a feel for what doing choreography is like. Because for the dance sector, anyone interested in becoming a choreographer, again, the major barrier to access there is the need for a studio and dancers, and they're generally really costly resources. And your ability to learn and develop your practice is limited to that precious time that you have in the studio with the dancers. So I guess we recognize that these technologies that we've been working with as a company in our various productions and projects actually present an opportunity to solve some really big problems for the dance sector more broadly. Obviously, we have to recognize that there are limitations in terms of how much of the experience of being in the studio working with real dancers translates into this virtual space. But there are also possibilities that emerge when you put this kind of thinking and process into a virtual environment that open up new creative possibilities for what movement ideas, choreographic ideas, and choreographic outcomes can be.
I'm excited to see what you're creating. And also it makes me think about the potential outcomes for the dance film industry. We have the No Box Dance Film Festival. This is our 6th year. And so we are constantly reviewing many different films from all over the world. And I feel like that could be an interesting avenue of exploration as well for creating dances through that platform that could then live on in kind of this digital space.
Yeah, that's certainly something that you can do in this. We're still not entirely sure where the greatest benefit will come in terms of the potential use of this kind of platform, because it does, on the one hand, support learning and creative exploration. It could work as a pre-visualization tool. So as a choreographer, for example, you could record some ideas in the studio, put them into the software. That's not an entirely straightforward process. There are, in terms of translating video into motion capture footage, but there are a growing number of solutions now where you can just record a video, upload it to a server, and AI will work its magic and extract a 3D model from it. Again, the quality isn't amazing, but it's good enough to have an approximation of the kind of ideas that you might have created in the studio, and then continue to develop and iterate on those ideas outside of the studio so that when you come back in, you've got that much further in your thinking. So that ability of this kind of platform to work in tandem with or parallel with the conventional real world process of creating dance in the studio is one possibility. But then the generation of purely digital outcomes is another. You can use it to create and structure and edit things in a way that would just be pretty much impossible to do in a real world studio setting, and to work at scale, again, that most people don't have the means to achieve, and to create film outcome from, or then to take that 3D content and export it into another piece of 3D animation software where another skilled developer could add more to it or build more around. So I think putting this kind of technology into the hands of dancers and choreographers and creators who know the currency of movement, but currently have to be really reliant and dependent on other people to do anything with, I think will hopefully be of value. I am just building a tool ultimately that serves my interests and solves the problems that I've encountered as a choreographer working in this space. But if it solves it for me, then hopefully it will solve it for lots of other people as well. And I'm really keen and curious to see what happens when we do put it out there and just see how it gets used, see what kinds of interests come to it, and I guess see how else we can potentially develop it in order to make sure it is really kind of delivering on the potential that I think there is.
I certainly am looking forward to it. And what I really love about your company most, I think, is how you're sharing and exploring dance across different digital platforms outside of just the works that you're creating. You've also created an interactive dance app, which is very exciting, which basically houses some of your projects and provides experiences for users to engage with those concepts in different works from their mobile device. And I'm curious about, why do you think dance needs to exist in this digital landscape?
I don't think it needs to, but I think there's an opportunity for it to. And I'm too curious not to explore that opportunity. And I think also, as our world becomes populated with a growing number of media options and platforms and possibilities, people are consuming culture, for want of a better way of describing it, in such a more probably diverse way than they might have done a generation ago, where there were much clearer distinctions and clear pillars between different forms of cultural experience.
Don't forget to say no to the box.
I think there are interesting possibilities for how we can think about the relationship between them, and how we can take a medium like dance and think about how it might exist across these different forms of media, rather than just exist entirely within one bracket of it. And also then how these different forms of engagement, viewing, participation afford different relationships to dance as a medium, as a practice. Again, one of my driving interests behind working with interactive technology is that it actually enables the public and people that might not have a huge amount of experience of dance to get closer to it and engage more directly with it, because you can build into systems of interaction choreographic concepts that will encourage and shape the way that people move and act in response to the feedback they're given as their movement is being tracked. And similarly, so in the app, one of the features we have is a augmented reality filter where you can see how the masks that we had created for one of our productions can exist on your face. And it was a bit of kind of an accident. in a way that this happened, and that we, in order to create these masks, went through a really interesting process with the designer working on that project, Anna Rekovic, who was, so the production we were making, Overflow, was exploring these considerations or questions around the impact of technology and social media. And she was inspired by, or interested in exploring how facial recognition technology maps to proportions of people's faces in order to obviously identify difference and thereby identify particular people. And so we scanned each of the 6 cast members' faces using photogrammetry. So we take lots of pictures from multiple angles to create a 3D model of their face. And then from those 3D models, she designed masks that mapped onto the particular proportions of each one of the dancers' faces, working around the principles of how these algorithms block out or triangulate different parts of the face. And so we had these 3D models that were then 3D printed, so that we then had the physical artifact that would fit each dancer perfectly. But what we realized is we had these 3D models, we had a digital render of each one of the masks, and we could take that and put it into Unity, into a 3D engine, and create this AR filter with it. So again, I think it's characteristic of the way that different art forms and practices are converging around the use of similar technologies. And so you can feed ideas and information in from one sector or practice, and then potentially spit it out into other forms and platforms that enable really different ways of engaging with and experiencing the thing that has come from a very different place. I think it also introduces problems and headaches as well, in that everyone feels the need to be doing stuff across all of these platforms in order to be relevant. There are obviously pros and cons. There are opportunities and challenges and risks on each one of these fronts, but I prefer to take the kind of more curious, optimistic view of the kind of what if.
Agree with those sentiments, because I feel like dance and the convergence of dance and digital technologies gives opportunity to take dance outside of this ephemeral experience, which was so fleeting and passing, and it's creating opportunities for a more long-lasting impact outside of just the memory of the experience, which is what really excites me about the relationship between the two.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. But then film has been around for a really long time, and dance has been filmed for a long time, which already changes something about that element of ephemerality. But you also recognize that there's always a difference between the experience of watching a film of dance and going to the theatre and watching dance live. And as we can see from the near 100 years or more of film technology existing, it hasn't replaced it. People will still cherish and prize what is of value in going to the theatre experience. And so that's where I think just curiously exploring these new possibilities and understanding, or developing an understanding of what they can offer, of how they change what dance can be, how it can be experienced, knowing full well that there's always the physical reality underlying it that will remain untouched and really inherently valuable in itself. And I think that's maybe why I've found it easy in some respects to go into this territory of exploring the use of digital technologies, because there's always a physical dance practice underlying it that brings me back to a grounded reality that I think maybe in some other contexts, the digital can pull you off into immaterial, heady places. And yeah, I really like that kind of, to some extent, the juxtaposition or the tension between those things. Because I think there's energy created in that tension of opposites. And that's creatively really stimulating.
Flash 4.
Alex, I've really enjoyed our conversation so far today. And for our final segment, we have our Flash 4, where we like to ask all our guests to answer 4 questions in a flash. So as fast as you can. Are you ready?
I'll give it a go.
All right. If you had to recommend a resource to our audience, what would it be?
The Digital Dance Studio, of course.
What was the first dance you saw?
I think it was Fred Astaire. It was one of Fred Astaire's films. It's one of the first I remember seeing.
Do you think social media has a positive influence on the dance world? Yes or no?
No. In the world in general, I would say.
What is your favorite social media platform?
I can't think of one.
How funny. You're so immersed in the world of digital technology and dance, yet no favorite social media platform.
Because I've made a deliberate choice not to use social media some years ago, not to look at it. Obviously, we use it as a company. Yeah, in terms of personal psychology, I've found it to have pretty negative impacts. So I just made a choice to delete it off all my phone. So I only generally go on there for work purposes, which is why I'm struggling to answer this. I've read too many books that want to put me off the whole thing. Yeah. So one of the books that inspired Overflow is a book called Psychopolitics by he's a Korean philosopher working in Germany called Byung-Chul Han. It's quite short, but it's pretty terrifying in a lot of respects in terms of his take on the impacts of new technology. So again, I think it's important to be aware of, again, and to see these things from all perspectives, because there can be a tendency to be seduced and carried away with the possibility and promise of technology without really being fully aware of the more negative, detrimental impacts of it. So it's something that I'm both drawn to the creative use of the technology, but also I'm really interested in thinking about the broader societal impacts of it as well, which I guess has led me to make certain choices about how I use it.
Well, we'll definitely link that book out in our show notes. It's important to have just as much education around the negative impacts of technology as much as I can definitely get swept away in the exciting seduction of what's happening and all these new exciting possibilities.
Okay, I'm going to say Ruben Margolin. He's a really interesting kinetic artist. So anyone that's interested in movement and dance, I think, can relate to the kinds of sculptural work he does. It's really beautiful, mesmerizing kinetic sculptures.
We will link it out for everyone listening. I appreciate you making time to come on our show today. I definitely have my journal pages filled with notes from our conversation. Is there anything else you'd like to leave our audience with today before you go?
I don't think so. I think I've probably spoken enough. Yeah, it's been really lovely talking to you, and yeah, hopefully what we've discussed is of interest to others as well.
And how can our listeners stay connected with you and the company? We already know you're not on social media, but the company.
I personally, yeah. So you can find the company at Whitley Dance Co. on that's our handle on all social channels, and we have a website which is alexanderwhitley.com. So yeah, look us up, get in touch, and yeah, look out for our new software platform. We're rebranding. It's going to be called something other than the Digital Dance Studio. So looking forward to announcing that soon.
Fantastic. We'll keep our eyes out and we'll make sure to share with our listeners. Thanks again, Alex, for coming on the show.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Dance Behind the Screen podcast is produced by Novox Dance, an art service organization that creates, collaborates, and discusses art with artists and the public. Dance Behind the Screen podcast is co-hosted by Azaria Hogans, Raina Mondragon, Martheya Nygaard, and Yejin Choi, with sound designed by Daniel Rosas.
Thanks for taking your time to tune into Dance Behind the Screen, a bi-monthly interview series where we go behind the screen to question process, product, and social media. Be sure to follow us on social media at KNOW Box Dance. See you next time, and don't forget to say no to the box.